You know how it is. Every offseason, there's always that one move that gets everyone talking. And this one has Seahawks fans completely split. Some people think it could be exactly what this team needs, while others believe it could create more problems than solutions. The crazy part is, there are actually good arguments on both sides. And once you hear everything, you might end up changing your mind. But before we jump into it, if you've been riding with the Hawks for more than 20 years, smash that like button and show some love for the channel. And down in the comments, let me know. Go Hawks! I want to see how many longtime Seahawks fans are watching today's video. The discussion surrounding Stefon Diggs has suddenly become one of the most interesting topics connected to the Seattle Seahawks. And it all started because the veteran wide receiver openly shared how he views himself at this stage of his career. Instead of claiming he still deserves to be considered the unquestioned #1 receiver in the NFL, Diggs made it clear that he believes nobody can name a better #2 receiver than him. That statement immediately sparked debate because it completely changes how teams might evaluate him as a free agent. Rather than trying to convince everyone that he is still the same player from several years ago, Diggs appears to recognize where he currently fits, while still believing he can outperform every secondary receiving option around the league. That confidence has naturally raised one important question. Should the Seattle Seahawks seriously consider bringing him in? The conversation becomes even more interesting when you look at the production behind Diggs's argument. Even though his numbers have gradually declined over the last several seasons, his production still deserves attention. Aside from the season in Houston that ended with a torn ACL, he consistently produced 1,000-yard seasons. Even during the year in which he suffered that serious injury, he was on pace to reach another impressive statistical milestone before everything came to an abrupt stop. Those facts explain why Diggs remains frustrated that he is still available on the free agent market. From his perspective, he believes he has already shown enough to deserve another opportunity, especially if a team is searching for an experienced receiver capable of making an impact without necessarily being the focal point of the offense. Another important element mentioned in the discussion is why Diggs remains unsigned despite his resume. There appears to be concern around the league that some organizations fear he might still expect to be treated as the unquestioned top receiving option. However, based on his own comments, that perception may not fully reflect reality. Instead, Diggs seems comfortable describing himself as the best second option available, suggesting that he has adjusted his expectations while maintaining confidence in his ability. That subtle difference changes the entire conversation because teams are no longer evaluating someone demanding to be the centerpiece of an offense. Instead, they are evaluating a player who believes he can significantly strengthen an already established receiving core. Once the focus shifts specifically toward Seattle, the discussion becomes even more layered. One point is made immediately and without hesitation. Jaxon Smith-Njigba is removed entirely from the comparison. The reasoning presented is simple. There is no debate over the Seahawks' primary receiving option in this scenario. The argument is not whether Diggs is better than Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Instead, the entire conversation centers around every other receiving position on Seattle's depth chart. That creates a fascinating comparison involving the remaining wide receivers. Rashid Shaheed is viewed as the favorite to occupy the #2 role. Cooper Kupp is another player who could become an important target by serving as a reliable safety valve within the offense. Then there is Torrey Horton, who is described as perhaps the biggest wild card among the group. According to the discussion, Horton demonstrated remarkable efficiency whenever he touched the football, consistently finding the end zone despite limited opportunities. His ability to score whenever he became involved in the offense creates the possibility that he could eventually develop into a much larger contributor if he manages to remain healthy throughout the season. The competition does not stop there. Additional receivers are also mentioned as players competing for roster spots. Jake Bobo continues to be recognized for his importance to Seattle while remaining a fan favorite. Cody White is also part of the discussion after making the team previously. Emmanuel Henderson Jr. enters the conversation as another developing player, while Irvin Charles receives recognition for the value he provides on special teams. Even so, the overall belief is that several of these players strengthen their case primarily through special teams contributions rather than by positioning themselves as immediate candidates for the second receiver role. Special teams value actually becomes one of the recurring themes throughout this discussion. Rashid Shaheed and Torrey Horton are both praised not only for what they can contribute as receivers, but also for the impact they can make in multiple phases of the game. That versatility becomes an important factor because roster decisions are rarely based exclusively on receiving statistics. The ability to contribute in several different ways increases a player's overall value to the team, especially when coaches are constructing the final roster. When statistical production is compared directly, the numbers clearly favor Diggs. His receptions, receiving yards, and touchdown totals exceed those of the Seattle receivers being discussed. From a purely analytical perspective, that creates an understandable argument in favor of at least exploring the possibility of signing him. If a front office evaluated only recent production, and if Diggs were willing to accept a reduced salary compared to previous years, there is a logical case for taking a closer look. The numbers alone suggest that he remains capable of contributing at a meaningful level. However, that is where the conversation begins shifting away from statistics and towards something considered even more important. Football is not presented simply as a numbers game. Production certainly matters, but it is only one piece of the equation. Culture, leadership, chemistry, and locker room fit become equally significant considerations. Those qualities cannot be measured on a stat sheet, yet they often influence whether a talented player ultimately becomes a successful addition to a team. The comments made by Diggs are used as the turning point in that discussion. Even though he deserves credit for recognizing that he is no longer viewed as the unquestioned top receiver in the league, there is still concern that his public comments reflect an individual-first mindset rather than a team-first mentality. That distinction becomes central to the evaluation because the Seahawks are described as an organization placing tremendous emphasis on building the roster around culture. Specific examples are highlighted to reinforce that philosophy. Ernest Jones is mentioned as someone who publicly supported his quarterback instead of criticizing him during a difficult stretch. Devin Witherspoon is also presented as an example of a player focused on the team rather than individual recognition. Those examples are used to illustrate the type of leadership and accountability believed to exist inside Seattle's locker room. The emphasis is consistently placed on players prioritizing the collective success of the group instead of personal attention. That philosophy ultimately shapes the conclusion reached in the discussion. While Diggs may possess stronger statistical credentials than several of Seattle's current receiving options, those numbers alone are not viewed as enough to justify bringing him into the organization. The belief expressed is that the Seahawks are constructing the roster from the culture outward, with John Schneider and Mike Macdonald prioritizing players who fit that identity above everything else. Under that line of thinking, even a productive veteran may not represent the right fit if questions remain about how he would integrate into the team's environment. As training camp approaches and additional roster decisions draw closer, this debate is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. The numbers create one argument, while the emphasis on leadership and chemistry creates another. That combination makes the possibility of signing Stefon Diggs one of the more intriguing conversations surrounding Seattle right now. The statistics may encourage a closer look, but the cultural fit ultimately becomes the deciding factor in this evaluation. With that in mind, what do you think? Would you bring Stefon Diggs to Seattle based on his talent and production? Or do you believe preserving the team's culture is the more important decision? The possibility of adding a player like Stefon Diggs naturally creates divided opinions because there is no denying what he has accomplished throughout his career. Even after everything that has happened over the past few seasons, the production is still there for everyone to see. His statistical profile remains stronger than several receivers currently competing for complementary roles, and that alone is enough to keep the discussion alive. If Seattle were making this decision based exclusively on box scores, receptions, yardage, and touchdowns, the answer would probably be much easier. A veteran with proven production would seem like an obvious addition, especially if he were willing to accept a contract that reflected his current market value instead of the contracts associated with the peak years of his career. But the conversation presented here makes it very clear that the Seahawks are looking at something much bigger than statistics. Every roster move has consequences beyond Sunday afternoons. Coaches are constantly evaluating how one player affects everyone around him, whether that influence is positive or negative. That is why the discussion repeatedly shifts back toward culture instead of production. Talent can help win games, but chemistry helps build consistency over an entire season. From this perspective, maintaining the environment already being established inside the organization appears to carry just as much importance as finding another productive receiver. One of the strongest points raised is that Seattle's current locker room has consistently projected unity instead of individual agendas. Rather than creating headlines through public criticism or personal complaints, the examples highlighted show players supporting one another during difficult moments. That attitude is presented as a defining characteristic of the current roster. Instead of focusing on individual recognition, the emphasis remains on protecting teammates and reinforcing confidence throughout the group. It is that foundation which raises hesitation about introducing someone whose public comments could be interpreted differently. The interesting part is that this discussion is not built around questioning Diggs's ability. In fact, credit is given where it is deserved. Acknowledging that he no longer sees himself as the league's unquestioned #1 receiver is presented as a meaningful step. For a player who spent years competing among football's elite receivers, accepting a different role is not necessarily an easy adjustment. That recognition deserves respect because many veteran athletes struggle with changing expectations as their careers evolve. Even so, the concern remains that confidence can sometimes cross into creating unnecessary distractions, and Seattle appears determined to avoid introducing those kinds of questions into a locker room that values stability. Another factor worth remembering is how many different options Seattle already has entering training camp. The competition is expected to be intense, with multiple receivers fighting for opportunities and roster spots. Rashid Shaheed, Cooper Kupp, and Torrey Horton each bring different strengths to the offense, while players such as Jake Bobo, Cody White, Emmanuel Henderson Jr., and Irvin Charles continue battling to prove their value. Some of those players strengthen their chances through special teams, while others are working to expand their offensive roles. That competition itself may ultimately provide the answers the coaching staff is looking for without needing to add another veteran to the equation. Torrey Horton remains one of the most intriguing names mentioned throughout this discussion because of how efficient he was whenever he touched the football. His ability to find the end zone created excitement despite limited opportunities, leaving open the possibility that a healthy season could reveal even greater potential. Meanwhile, Rashid Shaheed continues to be viewed as the leading candidate for the second receiver role, while Cooper Kupp offers the experience to become a dependable target within the offense. Those internal options naturally reduce the urgency to pursue an outside addition, particularly one who would arrive carrying significant attention. Ultimately, this debate comes down to two completely different philosophies. One side looks strictly at measurable production and sees a veteran receiver whose resume still compares favorably against many complementary options around the league. The other side believes the Seahawks are building something that extends well beyond numbers, placing equal value on accountability, leadership, and locker room chemistry. Based on the discussion presented, that second philosophy carries more weight, leading to the conclusion that Seattle should pass on signing Stefon Diggs despite his impressive production and experience. Whether fans agree or disagree, this is exactly the type of decision that generates passionate debate because both arguments have merit. The numbers suggest one possibility, while the emphasis on culture suggests another. As training camp approaches and more Seahawks news continues to develop, every roster decision will receive this same level of attention, making it fascinating to watch how the organization continues shaping the team. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to stay up to date with every Seahawks development as soon as it happens, make sure you subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss breaking news. Also, click on the video that's now appearing on your screen because that's where you'll find even more Seahawks coverage. The latest Seahawks updates, analysis, and breaking stories are waiting for you there, and you'll always find the newest information here first. Go Hawks!